Good morning, or well, good afternoon, everyone. We're kind of in the cusp of in between. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Employee Evolution, Preparing for Potential Human Resources Regulatory Shifts. I'm Becky Wyan on Ray's marketing team, and I will be moderating today's presentation. Before we get started, I do have a few housekeeping items to go over. You can find a copy of today's presentation under the handout section. And then if you have any questions during today's presentation, you may enter them in the question box. We will answer as many questions as possible at the conclusion of the presentation. However, to be respectful of your time, we know we may not be able to get to them all. Therefore, following today's webinar, Renee and Jess will go through their questions and we will get the answers to them and send them out in an email along with the recording and presentation. Okay, today's presenters are Renee West and Jess Hart. Renee is the director of our HR consulting services and provides HR guidance, compliance, and best practices to support our portfolio of clients. Jess is a member of our HR consulting team, and she is an HR consulting specialist. She specializes in supporting clients with employee relations, policy development, talent acquisition, retention, and so much more. I'm going to hand it over to them. Welcome, Renee and Jess.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. We are excited to be here. And I was told this morning that it's actually a holiday, that it's HR Professionals Day. So we all should be off work instead of being on this webinar, but that's great. So again, hope everybody is having a great day. Thank you for joining us. We are happy to provide some resources for you as we continue to be proactive and keep you updated as we start to hear any changes or updates that might affect you and your organization. Jess, would you like to say a few opening remarks?
Yeah, sure. Hey, everybody. My name is Jess Hart. As Becky said, I am an HR consulting specialist here at Ray & Associates. And yeah, as Renee mentioned, we are super excited to share some more information on the potential HR regulatory shifts that we're seeing, as well as some further updates and trends that we're seeing in the HR space too. So our hope is that you can walk away from this webinar with some really great information and some good resources for your use as well. So with that being said, Renee, I'll pass it back to you and we can get this started.
Thank you, Jess. So actually, we'll start to look at our agenda. If we can go to the next slide, please. As we mentioned, so we do have a lot of information that we're covering today, and please note that we're trying to just touch base and highlight the narrative to start the discussions. And there's also a resource page that we have at the end of this presentation that will provide supplemental information for you as well on the topics that we're discussing today. But as you have heard in the news, there's some proposed HR changes as it relates to the salary threshold for exempt employees. So we're going to touch on that today and also talk about what all comes with that proposed bill. Updates to the independent contractor classification, understanding the joint employer standard as they're looking at some changes as to that definition. Also talking about pay data reporting, diversity policies, and everyone's favorite, the I-9 actually some compliance updates here that came through this year. So we're going to talk through that. As Jess mentioned, employee handbook policies. We're also going to share some trends that we're seeing, and then also give you resources as the employer to be proactive in some best practices and how you can be ready for any of these potential changes. So next slide, please. So that's a lot of info for us. All great things. So the very first thing we want to talk through are the proposed changes to the salary threshold. Currently, as it stands, the current salary threshold of $684 per week, $35,568 a year for those salary exempt positions is in the Department of Labor is proposing a change to that. And as you can see there, they are looking at increasing that to $1,059 a week or $55,068 per year. We're also hearing that could go as high as $60,000, but the proposal right now has it at that $55,000 range. Also, as part of this proposed change, They're looking at increasing the salary threshold for those highly compensated employees that is currently at $107,432 annually to $143,988 annually. And then also built into this proposed change would be automatic increases in both of these every 3 years. So I've had a lot of clients ask, why are they looking at this? What are we doing? Why is there this change? So the Department of Labor is projecting that this will impact 3.4 million exempt workers. Also, we'll look at $1.2 billion in cost to employers and $1.2 billion income transfer from employers to employees. So this is very huge and is a very big expense as well for employers. The Department of Labor feels making these types of changes will increase worker productivity, reduce turnover, and have better balance in their workplace. So again, these are not past changes at this point. This is only in the phase of moving forward. So do we think that it's going to pass? Next slide, please. Talks a little bit about where we are right now. Final ruling is likely not to be issued until 2024. Even if it were to pass, employers will have a grace period of 30 to 90 days to comply. And as part of this too, the salary threshold, the duties test that is currently in existence, there are no proposed changes to that. So it's just right now, this is what we're hearing. And, you know, again, if you were part of the previous salary threshold update years ago, you know that it's best to be proactive. So again, that's why we're sharing this information as we continue to see this evolve over the next couple months. Next slide, please. So we'd like to do a poll question. Be sure everybody's awake and has had their coffee here this morning to move us into our next discussion point. But the poll question that we have is, has your organization completed and updated job descriptions for all of your roles? So we're interested in seeing your response. So we'll give you a few minutes here to...
A couple more seconds.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and close it and we'll share the results. You should be seeing them now on your screen.
Great, thank you. So it shows 53% of you do have updated job descriptions for your roles and 47 do not. So kind of half and half. One of the reasons why we ask that as we start to talk about job classifications, this is an important part of job descriptions that's included. So that is why we look at this and ask that question. So thank you for taking time to do so, and we can move to the next slide. Part of the continued proposed changes are looking at the definition of an independent contractor. And the Department of Labor's proposed rule would implement a multi-factor test to determine whether or not an employee is an employee or an independent contractor. According to the DOL, they're looking at ultimately the whole situation. So is the individual economically dependent on the employer, or are they truly in business for themselves? A lot of organizations use independent contractors. And this is one of those things where in looking at that classification exemption, really looking at your roles to determine, are they in fact independent or are they actually an employee? So the resources that we've given you at the very end of this, also we'll talk through this a little bit further, but this is just one of the caveats of the proposed changes as it relates to independent contractors. Next slide, please. This is one that we see and we're hearing a lot of feedback from employers on as it relates to the definition of joint employer standard. Under this new rule, 2 or more employees would be considered joint employers if they share or co-determine these matters governing employees. So for example, if you have staffing services that provide you with employees for your workforce, this could affect that joint employer standard definition. and really looking at who's providing the day-to-day direction, what are the conditions of employment. So if the NLRB does find joint employment where two employers share or co-determine their conditions of employment, this could change. And this is one of the biggest pieces of this proposed rule, that even if it were to pass, they do expect it to be challenged in court, because it does encompass so many different industries. And the joint employer standard is it's a gray area, as I'm sure you've never heard that in HR before. But yes, there's a gray area there. So how can they further define what that is? So stay tuned, but this is another piece of that proposed change. Next slide, please. One of the other parts of what they're looking at re-implementing is, this is from the EEOC, their expectation of wanting to resume pay data reporting for private employers. Those of you that might remember, back in 2017, this was the first time that the EEOC required employees to submit information on pay. This provides the EEOC with information on implementing efforts to be sure there's consistency in pay as it relates to race, gender, pay equity. I'm sure those of you that went through this process, it was daunting. And that's what we're hearing again is, do we really need to do this? Is there another way to do it? Is there a more efficient way to do it? So again, this is not something that is passed, but it is something that's part of this proposed ruling. The agency actually stopped doing this in 2019 because of so many complaints from employers on the collection of the process and the pay data itself. So again, if it were to pass, it would expect to be challenged, but this also leads us into some trends that we'll be talking about later as it relates to these resources. One of those is, looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion. So organizations now should be focused on ensuring that they have DE&I statements in their handbooks and their policies, and that there is a consistent process in policies as it relates to recruitment and selection, your comp and your benefits, your professional development and training, how are promotions and transfers conducted, how are your social and your recreational programs completed. And also, if you look at your policies as an industry, your layoff process, your terminations, ensuring that there's consistency in all of those to promote DE&I is very important, and will continue to be a focused trend as we talk about that later as well. And one of the biggest things too that we're seeing as part of this is supervisor and manager training for your team on what is the importance of DE&I, and ensuring that your supervisors and managers are aware of what would possibly be an infraction and how to address it. Who do they go to? What do these programs look like? And what are the policies within your organization? So again, another piece of how all this ties together. And we're going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. And I'm going to kick it over to Jess to talk about the I-9 form.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Renee. I appreciate it. And Renee just talked through all of those proposed regulatory shifts that we're seeing in the HR space. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we wanted to provide you with some further updates and trends that we're seeing as it relates to all things HR as well. So one of the biggest updates that we have seen come through this year is in relation to I-9s, everybody's favorite topic. So the first big change that we wanted to mention to all of you is that there is a new I-9 form. So in August of 2023, so just a little over a month ago, the USCIS did release a new Form I-9, which has been streamlined and shortened. And one of the biggest pieces of information for all employers to be aware of is that you can use the old Form I-9 through October 31st of this year. However, if you continue using that old I-9 form after October 31st of this year, then you could be subject to penalties. So our biggest piece of recommendation is, if you aren't already using that new I-9 form right now, is to go onto the USCIS website, download that new I-9 form as soon as you can and start using it as soon as possible too. That way you're not opening yourself up to those penalties if you do continue using that old I-9 form after October 31st of this year. And we did want to mention too, just some of the new updates that we're seeing in that new and revised I-9 form. By no means is this all of the updates that are included in the new I-9 form, but we did just want to mention some of the big updates that you will see. So they have reduced sections 1 and 2 to a single-sided sheet. If you remember in the old I-9 form that came out in 2019, section 1 was on one full page and then section 2 was on another full page. So they are really streamlining and shortening the I-9 form. They also have moved multiple sections into separate standalone supplements. So going back to that old I-9 form as well that came out in 2019, just for example, section 3 was for re-verification and for rehires. This on the new I-9 form is actually its own standalone supplement. It's actually supplement B. So that's another change to this updated and new I-9 form. And then last but not least, they removed the use of alien authorized to work in section 1, and they have replaced it with non-citizen authorized to work. So just a change in terminology there. Instead of using the term alien, they're now using the term non-citizen. So once again, this is not inclusive of all of the updates on this new I-9 form. This is just some of the major updates that we wanted to point out for all of you. And if we move forward to the next slide, another big update in the I-9 space is just an update to remote examination of I-9 documentation. So before we get into this big update, we do want to talk about the history of this as well. So as you can see on this slide, back on March 20th of 2020, right at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, DHS and ICE announced flexibility in complying with requirements related to the Form I-9. So what was the flexibility that was mentioned at this time for employers? They basically deferred the requirement that employers physically review new hires' identity and employment authorization documents, and instead they allowed for flexibility to review these documents remotely in order to complete the I-9 form. So basically what they were saying to employers is they didn't have to review a new hire's US passport or their driver's license and social security card. These are just a few of the I-9 or a few of the documents that someone could present in order to fill out that I-9 form. So employers didn't have to review those documents physically. They could review them virtually for the time being. And this flexibility actually ended on July 31st of 2023, so just a few months ago. And employers were given 30 days to perform all required physical examinations of eligibility documents for remote hires made between March 20th of 2020 and July 31st of this year. So for any hires, or for all employers, for any hires that were hired between March of 2020 and July 31st of 2023, and their I-9 documentation was reviewed remotely, as it's mentioned on this slide, employers were given 30 days to then examine those I-9 documents physically. So this is the history of the remote examination for that I-9 documentation, and it leads us to where we are now moving forward. And we can go to the next slide. All right, so moving forward, what does this look like for employers who want to continue examining I-9 documentation virtually? So moving forward, only employers who are enrolled in E-Verify may continue to conduct these verifications electronically after August 1st of 2023. So if you are enrolled in E-Verify and you are considered in good standing, then you can continue reviewing the I-9 documentation remotely, as I mentioned. And what's the process look like for employers who are, continuing to do this remote examination process? So as mentioned here too, the first step would be you'd have to conduct a live video interview with the employee to examine their I-9 documentation. You would complete section 2 on the form I-9, and within section 2, you would have to check the box in the additional information field indicating that you used an alternative procedure in order to examine the documents. That is included in the new I-9 form that I mentioned just a little bit ago. you would have to create a case in E-Verify that includes information in sections 1 and 2 of the employee's Form I-9. And then last but not least, you would need to retain all copies of I-9 documents that were presented during the I-9 verification process. So once again, this is the process moving forward for any employer that wants to continue reviewing or remotely examining the I-9 documentation moving forward. If you're an employer who would want to participate in this, but you're not enrolled in E-Verify, you can go online. It's a web-based system, and you can enroll. It's free, and it's available for all employers in the U.S. So those are the big updates that we're seeing in the I-9 space, and I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide. And we have another polling question. So the question is, have you completed an I-9 audit for your organization within the past year? Yes or no? And I'll give you some time to answer.
Just give it a couple more seconds.
Perfect.
All right. Go ahead and close it, and you should be seeing the results now.
Yep, I can see them. So 32% of you mentioned, yes, you have completed an I-9 audit within the past year, and then 68% of you has said, no, you have not completed an I-9 audit for your organization in the past year. So this is a really good question for you to ask yourself for your organization. We strongly recommend completing an I-9 audit at least once a year. That way you are checking to make sure that all of your employees have I-9 forms that are filled out. If any employee has been terminated within the past year, you can move their completed or their I-9 form into a terminated folder, and then make sure that you are retaining that for the required retention period for I-9 documentation. But this is just a great thing to ask yourself, once again, as from an employer perspective. And one good thing to note too is that Renee and I, from our HR consulting perspective and here at Ray & Associates, we actually offer services to complete I-9 audits on your behalf. So as you're thinking about all of the I-9 information that I just mentioned and completing an I-9 audit for yourself, please know that Renee and I can come in and support your organization with this. So with that being said, we can go to the next slide, and I'll pass it back over to Renee.
Great. Thank you, Jess, for sharing that information. As we talk about policies and HR, we always have to talk about handbooks and what should you have in your handbook as it relates to policies to also handle what we talked about earlier in this time. So as a best practice, when we look at any potential audits that you might have in an organization from the Department of Labor or Fair Labor Standards, one of the biggest pieces that they'll look at are what are your handbook policies surrounding payroll. So for example, how are you tracking your time for your employees? What is their approval process? What is the process for employees to report any errors? What are your employer obligations in processing errors? When should you have that paycheck back to that employee? What is your work definition? What are your work hours? How do you track your overtime? So what does your normal work week look like as well? The standard overtime policy is definitely another piece to include, along with your lunch break and your schedules. How and when are individuals able to take their lunch? Is it paid? Is it not? What does that look like as well? And also coordination of leaves as it relates to anyone that might be off on family medical leave or disability, what that looks like as well. And attendance policies, how that encompasses what that looks like as well. And payroll deductions, if you are taking things out of your paychecks other than the normal taxes, etc. If you're having where they can buy t-shirts and they need to pay for their t-shirt, ensuring you have authorization forms for them to deduct for you to take that out of their paycheck. That's one of the biggest things we're seeing from the audits that they're asking for. Show us what your process is if that's something that you would need to do. So again, just a reminder of the best practices of what to have in your handbook as it relates to what we're seeing out there for those audits that are coming through. Next slide, please. So one of the biggest things that we talked about earlier on the proposed changes is how employees are classified. Are they exempt? Are they non-exempt? this is one of the biggest parts of your employee handbooks that you should have outlined as to the job classifications within your organization, where those job descriptions come back into play of within that job description, this is an exempt position or it's a non-exempt position, having that included in your job description. And we provided at the end of this presentation resources for you to go back onto sites to be able to have the duties test and be able to look at the different types of exemptions. So really ensuring that you are looking at this now for what those potential changes might be and what that impact looks like. And also ensuring that you have a safe harbor policy for exempt employees. This is a very big part of what we're seeing in the employee handbooks that basically outlines what can and cannot be taken from an exempt employee's pay. So again, any questions you have on policies, Jess and I, as part of our services, have these resources that we can share with you and offer best practices as you move forward with compliance. Next slide, please. So one more question, poll question, but actually this has two different parts of it. Does your organization have an employee handbook? Is the first one. And thank you for answering these. We appreciate it.
Just give it a couple more seconds. Most people have voted. All right.
This is great to see. 93% of you say yes and 7% say no. We've definitely seen this increase over the past 3 to 5 years of organizations having these handbooks, no matter what their size. So great job, everybody. That's awesome. So the next part of the question is, does your handbook include the employee job classifications that we just spoke about?
And we'll give everyone just a couple more seconds.
Great. That's great to see. So we have 70% of you have said yes, you do have this in there, and 30% say no. Again, a very important part of the employee handbook, and the job classifications will be even more important as we move forward with any proposed changes. So good job. Great. So I feel like I'm a school teacher saying great job, everybody. But I know in HR, it seems like a lot of times there's always things that you're changing, but it's great to see everyone's doing what they should be. So we want to talk about what are we seeing as some trends in this year and going into next year as it relates to a number of HR things, but focusing on payroll trends. We're also seeing a growth in payroll outsourcing. Individuals and companies are looking at decreasing their processing time by outsourcing these duties. We're also seeing an integration of payroll with other human resource information systems, such as time and attendance, benefits, recruiting, onboarding. So seeing a lot of these platforms coming about and being able to help organizations, and also seeing a big increase in digital acceptance. So employees now more than likely have their checks direct deposited versus a real paycheck. So elimination of paper checks, so everything is digital, is also very helpful now as well. And we're seeing that only continue to increase. Next slide, please. And one of the biggest things that we wanted to kind of shed light on too is we look at the employee experience, and we talk about the different levels of the employee experience, from the recruitment experience to the onboarding experience to the offboarding experience. But now organizations are really focused on how can we help our employees really have access to their data, either on their phones, their mobile apps. How can we help them with their changing of their address or their tax forms? So many organizations are utilizing mobile apps to help with that efficiency and just that connection where, communication perspective, it's a great way as well to keep your employees updated by mobile apps. But we're seeing again, and we only expect this to continue to change and evolve as we all have our phones, and it makes it also easier on HR as well when you have some of these things being done behind the scenes. So it helps from that manual perspective of having to make these changes, but also helping to improve your employee experience. And also providing education for your employees on financial well-being. We're seeing a lot of this as well. What is the importance of 401k? How can you best, put your funds where they need to be? Just a great resource, and really taking time to spend with your employees. We're seeing a lot of organizations taking that extra time to provide that information. Next slide. I'm going to actually kick this over to Jess and let her talk about some best practices on how you can be proactive.
Thanks so much, Renee. So yeah, based off of everything that we just mentioned during this webinar, we want to kind of leave you with some proactive tasks that you can be doing right now. And the biggest thing is to not wait until these final rulings. Like Renee mentioned, all of the proposed regulatory shifts that she has already mentioned, they're not at the final ruling stage right now, but that doesn't mean that you should wait until that. What can you be doing right now in order to stay ahead of the game? So you can review current job classifications, see if any of those job classifications might need potential changes, and see which jobs might be impacted by the proposed salary threshold change. Do you have any roles at your organization who are earning less than $60,000? Maybe you might have to give raises to keep those employees, salaried workers, exempt from overtime entitlement. Looking at roles that might need to be reclassified as well. Also looking at your need to assess the budget impact, looking at this from a holistic perspective for your entire workforce, identifying new compensation approaches as well, and effects on those impacted employees that might be impacted by the proposed salary threshold change. And with all of that being mentioned too, if you're looking at your entire workforce, then this might even be an opportunity to assess other exemption-related issues too. And if we go to the next slide, we have some additional proactive tasks just to go through as well. So reviewing your current job classifications for all employees. Renee mentioned this during an earlier part of our presentation, but looking at who are your hourly employees and who are your salaried exempt employees, looking at their job duties, and once again, their job classifications. Ensuring that your employee handbooks are updated and include policies for payroll and time tracking, leave policies, Department of Labor pay policies, overtime, and also the FLSA break policies too. So once again, as we mentioned, Renee and I do offer this with our services, and we're happy to come in and look at your employee handbook and even create an employee handbook for your organization if you don't already have one. And then last but not least, going back to those I-9 updates, making sure that you begin utilizing that new I-9 form as soon as possible, and then also completing an I-9 audit of your existing practices and forms for your current employees. So those are some proactive tasks that you can be taking right now, and do not wait on the final rulings for those proposed changes that we mentioned. And with that being said, I believe the next slide is questions. So right now we'll open it up for all of you to ask any questions that you may have.
So at this time, we have none. We can give everyone a quick second if you want to put them in, or I will go. These resources, as I mentioned, we will be sending this presentation out afterwards, plus it's in the handout section, so you can get all those links. No, we're taking in a lot of information. So here are Renee and Jess's information. Do not hesitate to reach out to them later with questions. Again, we know we shared a lot of information with you, but they are happy to answer any questions you have. Oh, we got one. Okay, first question, what is the retention period to keep an I-9?
That is a great question. I can answer that, Renee. So off the top of my head, I don't have that information right now, but you can access that information online on the USCIS website. There's a form that you can download, and it has the retention period noted online. And Becky just went through the resources that we'll be providing you after this webinar, and that's linked, so you can access that there.
Perfect.
Next question, do you expect the IRS definition of subcontractor in the Department of Labor definition to vary substantially?
You know, that's a great question, and I think it's all going to be dependent upon, you know, what these proposed changes are, and to how that correlates from the IRS perspective. So I'm sure there's discussions based on those two entities speaking as to what that looks like. So don't know that for sure right now, but we'll see.
Perfect. All right. We don't have any additional ones at this time, so just look for this recording to be sent out to everyone. And again, if you think of something later, their contact information is there, or you'll receive it in the slides when I send them out.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.